My name's David Levy. I'm director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, and this session is one that we're very happy to partner with Jen on, and you can see the topic, whether social magazines and news reading apps are game changers. I'm just going to say just a couple of words about the Reuters Institute before I pitch into the topic. We're based in Oxford, in England, and our core funding comes from the Thomson Reuters Foundation, but we're part of Oxford University. And we're basically, we're a combination of three things. We run a fellowship program for mid-career journalists from around the world. So if you are one of those, or you're interested in becoming a better journalist, look at our website and get in touch with us. We're a think tank publishing and writing about some of the most pressing issues in the nature of journalism worldwide at the moment. And we're also an academic research institute since 2006, when we became an institute. The fellowship program has been going for about 28 years. It's had 500 journalists from about 90 countries. I'm really pleased that we're doing this session, really for a couple of reasons. Firstly, within the Institute, Nick Newman, who will be the second speaker, will present some findings from a survey that we're going to be publishing in July about changes in people's behavior in terms of how people consume, discover, and share news. But also because I think, in a sense, in the last session, our Norwegian colleague sort of presented a very sort of moving film about events there. I guess this session is simpler in the sense that most of you probably have in your hand, either in your computer or a tablet device, you've got the elements of what we're talking about in this session, about how news organizations are going to present their content, how their content's going to be discovered and how it's presented to people, and the increasingly kind of promiscuous world in which we live, where, as Bruno Patino said this morning, there's no route to market that you should either deny yourself or that you should prevent your users finding you through. He had that rather interesting story, I thought, about many of his colleagues sort of saying, we can't let them do that. And he was saying, you've got to let them do what they want, and they've got to find you whichever way they can. And in a sense, that's what this session is about. I mean, I was, in the last few days, on my sort of iPad, I've just been looking at what you can get in France in terms of news. And it's just interesting when you look at the contrast between Le Monde, which is a newspaper which operates entirely through its own website. You can download an app on here, but you pay your money to Le Monde Direct and you register with them. To The Guardian, which is through Newsstand, and other people who are through a variety of different intermediaries. That's what the session's about today. I'm not going to introduce all our speakers. I'm going to ask, you've got the details of people here, but what I'm going to do first is I'm going to ask Jim Brady to kick off proceedings, and Jim is editor-in-chief of Digital First Media. Jim and Nick will both present for up to about 10 minutes each. Then Madhav and Robert Picard will come in on the back of those two things, those two presentations. We'll make it more of a conversation at that stage, and that's the stage where I want to get all of you involved. Because things are running a little late, we're going to finish this after 50 minutes rather than an hour. So we'll finish this session at about, as it says, at about 5:30. Okay, Jim, over to you.
Good afternoon. When a question is asked very directly as the title of the panel, I figure I could just start by answering it, and it's, are social magazines and news rating apps game changers? My answer to that would be no. They're a key part of the puzzle, an important part of what we're trying to do to reinvent journalism in a digital age, but they're not game changers all by themselves. And to use maybe inappropriate baseball metaphor, being that I'm not in the United States, I think social magazines and news reading apps are a single or a double maybe, but they're not home runs, because in the digital world, success is made up out of success hitting a lot of singles and a lot of doubles. There isn't one thing that I think is going to change the game completely for us, but we have to participate in all of these methods and all of these strategies that will help change it over time. In terms of why I think they're important, I think it's pretty obvious that the methods of media consumption are just changing by the day, and the consumers coming into the market and those that have been in the market for some period of time have made it pretty clear about what they want. And what they want is they want choice. They don't necessarily want to consume a package that contains content from one brand. They want a package that contains items of interest from multiple brands. And they don't necessarily want to get it on the platform you're delivering it to them. They want to get it on their mobile phone or their iPad or a web browser or a variety of other ways. And they want to consume information by subject in a lot of cases and not by brand. If they're interested in a certain topic, they want to get as many different people weighing in on that topic as they can. So making those assumptions and knowing how much consumers want that experience, you have to step away from, I think, what is the greatest enemy of the old way of thinking in journalism, which is the desire to maintain utter and complete control over everything that we do. And we live in a world in which control has long since been taken away from us in terms of how consumers get information and how they're going to get the journalism that we produce. And I did a panel, the American Society of News Editors last year, and the panel's description basically said, learn how to find out how to participate in social media without giving up control. Right? I mean, anybody who's lived any time in social media and has employed media strategies in the social world knows you don't maintain control. You can't maintain control of everything that you do in the world that's as disaggregated as this one. So you have to give up control if you're going to participate in social magazines and news reading apps as a first step. If you can't get beyond that, then you're not going to be on any of these platforms and you're going to pay the price for it. Because I believe that the more control you try to exert over how your content is distributed, the less successful you're going to be. The world has changed and we have to change with it. So let your content serve as a traveling salesman all around the digital world for your brand. If you're producing high quality content, whatever subject that you're covering, get your stuff onto Twitter and onto Facebook and onto LinkedIn and onto social reader apps and onto every iPhone. Create an Android app and an iPhone app. Do all of the things you have to do to let as many people in the world know that you're producing high quality content. And I think if you let your content serve as that sort of traveling salesman, then eventually you're going to pick up the audience and you'll be able to figure out how to monetize that. I think right now what control has cost us, and what control has cost us in the newspaper industry in the United States is probably billions of dollars. The absolute resistance to giving up control is what we have to get around, and we have not done a very good job to this point. So yes, let's pay attention to social magazines and news reading apps. They're really important, but they're not going to change the game all by itself. And as we know, there have been about 10 or 12 things over the last 15 years that we were told were going to save journalism. And the truth of the matter is all of them are part of the puzzle for saving journalism. But the only things that are going to save journalism more broadly are sort of bold ideas and aggressive transformation and a willingness to leave the past behind and think about new ways of distributing information and relating to our readers. I think the interesting phase that we're hitting now in social magazines and news reading apps are a big part of this is that I've been on the digital realm now since 1995. And once we launched websites, we spent an awful lot of time on those websites, even up until a few years ago, focusing all of our efforts on the homepage. The homepage is what matters. The homepage is what we have to spend all our design resources and what everybody in the newsroom has to get fired up about all day long, when in the end, what we really should have been focusing on was the article. Because the article page is where, via search and via blog links and via social media, you're actually getting more people coming to your websites. Their first view of your website is more often going to be an article and not a homepage. And it took the news media in the industry in the United States a decade probably to figure out, and certainly 5 years longer than it should have, to figure out that the energy has to go into your article page if you're going to build new audience. Because your existing audience probably comes to your homepage already. You've already won those people over. The article page is where you get all your leads, all your potential of building new audience. And what I fear is happening now is we're starting to make the same mistake again, that just as we finally get a lot of media organizations in the United States realizing that the focus has to be on the website and not the newspaper anymore, like now we're so focused on the website that we're missing this phase, which is the website's actually becoming less and less important in the grand scheme of things. It's a key part of your strategy, probably the dominant part of that strategy for the next couple of years. But what's happening on the sites of the world and what's happening in social media, what's happening in mobile, it's becoming obvious pretty quickly that much more of your audience is going to be consuming your content via something that's not print and is not the web. It's going to be a third whole category of content consumption. So So I think these are all things we should be focused on, and I personally very much believe that, you know, in letting control go and getting your content on all these properties as quickly as you can. But I think anybody who's trying to rank them in order of importance, I think, is missing the point, which is at some level they're all important. And I know we like to live in a world in which we can point to one little silver bullet and say, if we just do this right, everything's going to be fine. But that world is long since past us, and what we're looking at now is fighting on a lot of fronts and finding that some of the things we try aren't going to work and hoping that a lot of the other ones will, and assuming that they will. But I think this is where we have to begin, which is you know, you can't change the game until you change your thinking, basically, and I think that's where we're still short. So when I hear there are organizations fighting, participating in social magazines, newsreading apps, and social media, you know, it makes me wonder if we're going to make this turn fast enough, but I hope that we will and expect that we will. And I'll turn it over to Nick.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to answer the question at the end of my, my chat when we've been through some slides. So good afternoon, I'm Nick, and I've been involved with online news for over 15 years, starting out in the early days of online news with the BBC. And I think it's just interesting reflecting back on the sort of waves of news aggregation and personalization that we've seen, which I think up until now you can kind of characterize as a series of false dawn for these tools that we're going to put users in control to intelligently select the news and push it to you. So I remember looking at digital news butlers in research and development in the early 1990s, and then we had Pointcast and RSS revolution, news readers that select your sources, and then news organizations themselves went through this sort of wave of trying to personalize what they did, and somehow these only really caught on with small numbers of people. So really I just wanted to address why that was and what might be different this time, what some of the different ingredients are. And I'm just going to draw on a bit of the research that David referred to earlier that we've just done for the Reuters Institute on digital consumption. And it's a big sort of 5-country study that doesn't come out until next month. But I think there are some clues in the data, but also in some of the other research that's been done over the years. And I think what we know is that, as Jim said, people are no longer wedded in an online world to one or two sources of news. In the online world, you have these undreamed range of sources from any part of the world, which you can access at the click of a mouse or the touch of a finger. On the other hand, if you look at what people actually say, the majority do still tend to stick to a relatively small number of sources. So this is looking at people who are looking at it on a computer, on a mobile, and on a tablet. And in general, 70 or 80% are still using less than 3 sources. Tablet users a little bit more, but even there, the majority are still using a restricted number. So device is a factor, but the biggest difference is how much news you consume. So the segment on the left here is a group of very, very heavy news users in the UK, and you can see that 36%, over a third of those, are now using more than 4 sources every week. But despite that, the sort of broad evidence is that in a world of unlimited choice, the majority of people are still comfortable with a relatively small number of sources they know and trust. In our survey, for example, in the UK, showed that 58% of online news users in the UK access BBC News every week, for example, which is not as much as in the offline world, but still not much different in terms of overall share. Of course, the other big question is, how do people get to those trusted brands in the first place, and how is that changing? So in our survey, we asked people about how they find news, how do you get to news, so we could understand the relative importance of brand as opposed to other more aggregated ways of discovery, such as search, such as social media, and of course some of these personal and social aggregators, the ones we're talking about this afternoon. And what this chart shows is that they think about a news brand first, and Pew in the States have come up with similar findings when they go looking for news. Search is clearly important at number 2, but the big game changer in the last few years that we've seen is social. So showing here in this survey at 20%, who say they now discover news via social networks, and it's much, much higher for younger demographics. So combine that with personalized newsreaders and apps are now making a significant percentage of the referrals. So driving this is really two things. So firstly, the idea that you're more likely to click on something that's sent by a friend, by somebody you know rather than a faceless news brand, so 57% in our survey. And the other side of the equation is you've got these new tools, of which social newsreaders are one, that's making it just easier and simpler to share. And so as a result, more people are doing it. So these are the international figures which show that between 12% in Germany and 28% in the United States are sharing news every week via a social network like Facebook and Twitter, or through the social newsreading apps. And that figure is much higher if you add in email as well. So what we're seeing is social really beginning to kick in now. And of course, social is one half of the combination that is a social newsreading app. The other part is, of course, tablets and smartphones, the devices themselves. And this data, which is going to be published in our forthcoming survey, gives you a sense of how people are accessing those now across 5 different countries. So mobile really beginning to make an impact, with highest penetration we found in Denmark and lowest here in France, but still, getting on for a fifth of populations, and tablet obviously on the rise in a significant way. So these are the percentage of weekly use, and this is important because it's not only because on these platforms people are also consuming more news, they're also consuming more news sources, as we've seen, but also these are platforms where personalization seems to be taking off much more, because these are very much personal devices that you can tie down to an individual. So in terms of answering the question directly, I would say, like Jim, that they're not a game changer per se, they're part of the picture. I think that people do want more news, they're hungry for more perspectives, they recognize they can't come from a single source, but they are very much time constrained, and that's really important. So I think there is a role for intelligent aggregators to do much more of that through algorithms, but clearly there's also a role for news brands themselves to do more aggregation and curation themselves, as they are to an extent with some of the live blogs that we've been hearing about in this conference. The big driver, though, from a consumer's point of view, is how do I get more relevant news at a time and a place that is right for me? How do I know about the general stuff, but also how do I keep across my specialist work niche or sport interest or whatever it happens to be? And I think that news and social aggregators can definitely play a role in that, but they're just part of the spectrum. From a news producer's point of view, the primary focus, in my view, should be how you meet those fundamental consumer needs, as much as possible within your own control, taking into account these big changes of social and mobile. So how do you respond to the opportunities to create more personal experiences on tablets and mobiles? How do you ensure a much higher level of social connectedness within your own journalism, as Jim said, working with audiences and ensuring your content is open and shareable? Thank you.
I'd like to, thanks very much to Jim and thanks very much to Nick. I'd like to turn first to Madhav to pick up on some of those points. I guess Nick talked about some intelligent aggregators. I guess is that who you represent on this platform?
Well, I do work for a search engine, yes.
But I mean, in terms of Google Currents, Google News, I mean...
yeah, I think definitely, and I think each of those, and by the way, while I was in the audience, I had some issues with the sound, so I hope you can hear me in the back. If you can't, sorry, I'll speak louder. Is this better? Okay. I just wanted to check because I could never tell. Yeah, so I think actually there's, you talked about Google News and Google Currents, and they're actually two different things. So Google News, as everyone knows, is a news aggregator. Google Currents is quite interesting. It's a news reading app, if you think about it from a user perspective. and it's a news platform if you think about it from a publisher perspective. And I'm scared that we're going to all agree. And I always worry on a panel when everybody agrees, because it's either that it's a stitch up or we're completely all wrong. But I do agree. I think that social magazines and news reading apps are part of the puzzle, and I think they're all doing different things in different ways. So you've got if you look at the news reading apps, Flipboard is very, very beautiful, very elegant. Like it very much. Zeit is very interesting, doing some very interesting things. I think with semantics. I think Currents is doing something different about trying to balance the need of the user with the need of the publisher by retaining the brand and the relationship. And I was very interested in what Jim was saying about, you've got to let go, and I do completely agree with that. And I think that the definition of a brand now has changed so much, and it's about the relationship that you have with your audience, and your audience is going to be completely diverse and doing different things. So all 5 of us on this panel will probably consume news in completely different ways. Each of us will consume news in different ways at different times of the day. And I think it's about letting go, being able to do that, but retaining, I guess control is probably the wrong word, but the brand for the relationship. And that's why we built in Google Currents that it's edition based. So every time you're reading an edition from The Guardian or the HuffPo or from some of the digital first properties. And we think that's one of the important things to balance out what the experiments in this space.
And isn't there a tension here between, as I think Nick talked about it, giving people a kind of personalized service that gives them the news they want, and the extent of kind of context and the relationship between the content that you're providing through something like Google Current and the extent to which there's clarity about the content and the context in which it was originally presented?
I think there's always a natural tension there. The other way to look at it is the news that that you want and the news that someone thinks that you should want. And there's always that moment where maybe those two things don't actually overlap, and you either change the channel or you don't read the article or you flip the page. I think that what these things are doing are different at different times of the day in different places. So actually you may want a really personalized experience when you have more time, when you're there and you want that. And there may be a time where, it's late at night, you just want to sit and have somebody read you the news on television. Or what I do, which is I listen to the radio while I'm brushing my teeth. And so I think there's lots of pieces of this puzzle, which is I think one of the things I would definitely pick up on. I think that the puzzle pieces have been thrown completely up in the air, and we're putting the pieces together now. I'm not sure anybody knows what the picture will actually look like, but I think we're trying.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to you, Madhav. Can I just turn to Robert? And, Robert, how do you see these tendencies in terms of the issues for brands and recognition of brands and the role of the kind of editor, if you like, as the curator?
Well, I think the real issue that's happening here is we don't have a choice of whether or not readers, we don't have a choice of whether or not various social magazines and readers are going to grow in importance. What we have a choice on is whether we make use of them to best possible use. And so at one part it's letting it go, but on another part it's channeling the uses. And so if you have a social magazine, you really don't have control over how it's displayed or whatever within the magazine. Once it gets to your material, then you do. You can, however, have your own social reader, as a number of news organizations have done, which essentially is where you're sharing your own content, so obviously any choice they have is bringing them to you. But ultimately, the question becomes, if you're going to be using social readers, if you're going to have social magazines there, if you're going to have any kind of social distribution there, when people come to you, how do they know it's you? And that ultimately is the real issue that comes in. Now, clearly you can't curate in the same way because you don't control the table of options. But your choices are, when they come to you, what options do you give them at that point to do other things with you rather than go back to the social magazine or something of that sort?
Okay. I want to open this up in a minute. I just want to put one question to Nick and to Jim, because I think I heard rightly when I heard Jim saying you've just got to give up control. And I think I heard Nick say you've got to give the user what they want whilst retaining as much control as you can. Is that what I heard, Nick?
Yeah, I guess I think that the brand themselves has that relationship with the audience, and I think there is a real danger, whether you're talking about Facebook or Google or anybody else, of giving a lot of that away. I mean, people have said this already, it's about a lot of this is now competing on experience. How can you provide the best experience? And I think one of the things that Flipboard and those other great social newsreading apps have done is really raise the bar. But what brands have to do is to make that experience really good, because they know their audience that's absolutely suited for the audience, and then people will come there, because otherwise they're going to lose revenue. Somebody else will be getting in the way of getting that revenue. The journalism won't be paid for. So I think there are some big issues, and I think the core thing is clearly you can't expect everyone to come to your properties all the time, absolutely, and therefore you have to play with all of these opportunities, and you make decisions about how much it's going to cost, whether it suits your audience or not, to play on those platforms. But that absolutely shouldn't mean that you have to first and foremost focus on your own audience and your own properties, in my view.
Jim?
And when I say give up control, obviously your own website, your own mobile presence, you will control that completely. How you get people to that and how your content is represented on other sites, you have to give up control over, because you're not going to be able to force Facebook or Twitter or Zeit or Flipboard to say, I want my content displayed exactly this way, because they'll probably just say, whatever, and move on. So I think it's, we're used to, in the newspaper industry certainly, we control how everything we produce look to the nth degree. That's why we took 2 years to redesign a sports section. But now we're out in the world putting our stuff out there, and not giving, and the giving up control part's been the biggest psychological problem in the States, because I was editor of WashingtonPost.com for a long time, and if we brought a new idea into the newsroom, almost invariably the first 5 people who commented on it told you how it could go wrong, as opposed to how this might help us. And I think that mindset really kept us from, a lot of people from wanting to try anything. And I think that's what we have to get over. We have to try all of these things, and many of them we have very little control over.
I thought your story about the amount of time that people spent debating what their homepage looked like rather than what the stories looked like was a very telling one. Let me open up discussion and see who wants to come in at this stage. Can you put your hand up if you want to ask a question? There's one here. Can I see a couple of other hands of people, so I've got a sense of where we're going to next? All right, we'll start here, but don't be shy. Okay, yes.
Thanks. Just 2 questions. Firstly, with regards to implicit and explicit personalization, who thinks algorithms are going to win and who thinks it's going to be a curated affair? And then secondly, how do you buy into the argument that it's necessary for brands to almost limit the quality of their articles that are fed through social readers in order to drive people back to their own sort of websites where you carry good content, great images, all of the things that your titles are famous for?
Can you just tell us who you are, where you come from?
Sebastian Stone from South Africa, Media24.
Okay, thanks. 2 questions there. Who wants to pick up which?
Shall I take the algorithm question?
Yes, I think that's logical, yes.
Yeah, but ironic, since I'm deeply untechnical, so I actually don't know what an algorithm really is. But no, I think as ever, it's going to be a balance. I don't think one is going to win. I don't think it's human curation versus, versus algorithmic computer curation. I think that these things actually build upon each other, and you need to figure out what's the right level of each in all the expressions that you're coming up with. And I think the technology is going to get better to make these things easier. And so if you saw, Storyful was a really interesting example, actually, because they use algorithmic curation as well as human curation. Again, I think that's a real example of what will grow about how you balance both things.
Well, essentially, you have to think of all of these things as different products when you deal with them. And your home product is where you build the curation, the personality, the brand for the people that are going to come to you regularly and come directly to you. All of these others are for those that don't come regularly or who have never seen you before but suddenly get exposed to you and say, oh, there's something I want to see about. then you need to grab them at that point so that they start coming back regularly outside of these kind of magazines and apps. But each has to have a different strategic purpose in the way you're using them and what you're putting on pages to draw and attract people in different ways.
Jim?
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I think, as usual, the answer to the question about is it going to be this or is it going to be this, the answer is usually yes. It's going to be probably a bit of both. I mean, there's a very few yes or no questions in the digital world right now that you can answer absolutely, confidently. But, just going back to Robert's point about getting people to the site, I also think it means rethinking how we build our websites, because I think, and we're trying to do this in a redesign we're doing for all of our dailies right now, is how do you sell your site? How do you sell what you're about on the article page? I mean, we always, again, going back to that homepage versus article page argument, we spend all of our time trying to sell our site on the homepage with all these awesome things we did today. People who are on your homepage are probably already buyers. And they got to your homepage, and we don't, it's not, people don't come to homepages from search engines and Twitter feeds very often. So I think we have to focus on how do you build an article page that's actually going to sell your brand, because that's where you're getting all these people in now. And how do you sell your site on Zeit and on Flipboard? How do you let people know that beyond this thing you're reading here, there's actually a really deep well of high quality stuff? And I think that we're still struggling with that.
Yeah, Madhav?
I just wanted to add to, because I think you asked about, should you put less good out there and then, kind of try and move them back over here with better stuff over here.
Sorry, I didn't want to throw you under a bus there.
Sorry?
I didn't want to throw Google under a bus there.
No, feel free. We're big. We'll be fine. No, I think that, going back to what's just been said, is that actually you got to think about those users, and actually I would say you want to put your best foot forward, right? Because they may not know who you are, and if you're giving your less good stuff to the new user, guess what? I don't think they're going to be going back. And again, I think it's about that balance of what you think strategically is right and to do for you. And some of the things I think that we're thinking about at Google, particularly for Currents, is what's that balance and how do we make this complementary with what the publisher is doing. So one very simple thing is that you create an edition in Google Currents and you can plug in your Google Analytics ID, and that is shown up in your Google Analytics report. Currents comes up in the same way that different sections of your site come up. And that shows the kind of complementary nature I think that we're trying to balance out in that.
Madhav, why, as I understand it on Google Currents, in order to activate it, I need to log in with my kind of Gmail or Google sort of user ID. Why is that necessary?
Because we think, I don't know how many people were here for Krishna's talk in the beginning, but I think he was absolutely spot on that users expect a multi-platform experience. So they expect to get something on it may be their Android phone and their iPad. And therefore, you need to know who they are to be able to give them that, uniform experience completely. Because I think people just want things to just happen, right? They don't actually want to be able to mess around with it or log in and do all, they expect everything everywhere now. I think that the digital world has just created that expectation level that we're all actually trying to catch up with.
Okay. Other questions out there? Who else wants to ask a question? There's one here. Can I get a sense of anybody else who's interested in asking a question at the moment? Okay.
Thank you. Madhav, I don't want you to ask to contradict him, but Eric Schmidt made a comment.
Remind us who you are, Peter.
I'm sorry, I'm Peter Bail from CNN. Eric Schmidt made a comment there recently about how he was concerned that the web was breaking into kind of closed boxes and that apps were part of that process. How does that fit into this discussion where content is in a single box and Flipboard or Zeit, but then Google is arguing for a more open approach?
Yeah, we consider our platform to Currents to be open. It's on Android and iOS, so we're trying to make the open in that element. And I think what you're also seeing, and then part of the reason for things like this, is this huge explosion of tablets and smartphones. And I think the publishers and the content is trying to catch up with with the different size of devices, with the different possibilities, and all that. And actually, there's a whole discussion that we could have about the resources that it takes to do things in this multi-platform way. And so I think we're trying to do something that simplifies a lot of this for both users and publishers.
Okay. I'd just like to ask the panelists a question. I mean, the one thing we didn't address explicitly, I think none of you addressed explicitly, is how this impacts on revenues, if at all. and I'd just like any of you who feel up to that, to dealing with that hot topic.
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, like a lot of the things we're doing in the digital world, we're trying to build the audience first, and obviously what we would like to go to is down the road have a model where our advertising travels in all those places that the articles travel to. If we're going to send our content out to all these different platforms and all these different vendors, then obviously if you can send your ads along with that, that's a pretty big selling point. Right now, a lot of it is it's recruitment. It's let's get our content in places where we can build readership in areas where we have papers and obviously outside as well. And then once we can get, then it's that chain. All right, we got them on, they found us on Zeit, they read something on Zeit, they liked it, they came to our site, and we were able to close the deal by kind of proving to them that this site has a lot of quality content on it. So I think that's a lot of it for the moment, but we're in active conversations with pretty much all the vendors we're working with to try to have a revenue model associated with all these different places we're sending content out. But I think the mistake of saying, well, I'm not going to put my content onto any of these platforms until there's a proven revenue model, I think that's, you know, we're all trying to figure this stuff out in real time, and if you're going to wait until that happens, you're going to be late to the game.
Isn't there a danger, though, that by giving the content away, you're enabling these aggregators to build up the brands, and then people get hooked into that experience and never actually come all the way through? Like a lot of the Facebook apps, for example, just keep people in Facebook, so you never get back to, I mean, there are real dangers about the tension and who's got the power here with the Googles and the Facebooks, aren't there? Yeah,
I would agree with that I'm concerned about it. I'm also concerned I've probably put on 3 pounds since I got to France, but it's a fact. And you know, there's only so much you can do about the wave that's changing. And if digital first media, with our 75 dailies, decide we're going to set out all these social platforms, it's going to make a nary a dent in the trend anyway. So I think right now it's sort of let's continue to try to figure this out the way we are in real time, and we'll make adjustments if things get more ominous or more problematic in terms of deal terms.
I mean, I guess part of the issue is how strong is your brand? Because if you're a very strong brand, you've obviously got more leverage, and if you haven't, then you have to play in these platforms and with these newsreaders.
Okay, question here at the front.
Thank you. I'm Bambang Harimurti from Indonesia. I was just wondering, especially Mr. Madhav from Google, I mean, now there is a business model where you can get advertisement revenue from countries all over the world without having even to have an office in that particular country, let alone pay taxes. I think this is going to create backlash to this model of business. So is there any thinking about how, you know, otherwise you can be quickly accused as the neo-colonialism or something like that?
I assume, Madhav, you personally pay tax, but I think the question may be addressed to your employer.
Yeah, I definitely do pay tax,
okay.
just to clarify that.
Okay.
And actually pay surprisingly more than I thought I had to in my last tax return, but that's a whole other story. I think that at least I can talk specifically about what we're doing with Google Currents. And I think what we're doing, and you know, we're working with our partners to roll out the advertising, an advertising solution there, and we want to work with them. And as I said, we want to see that to be complementary with what they're doing. And you know, as Jim was saying, we want their ads to be showing up on Google Currents. We think that's a very important part because it's part of their brand, part of their experience, and therefore there is going to be a revenue model behind that. And of course, they'll have to deal with their own taxes.
Robert, yeah.
A lot of the issues in the globalized world are simply because laws have not caught up with practice. And there would be nothing under international law that would prohibit one from taxing activities within any given country or not. The question is, how do you measure what's appropriate? How do you deal with those? But there are mechanisms in the future that will allow us to do that.
I was very struck by the contrast between the Norwegian contributor to the last session on ethics, who was talking about the importance of ethics within a national context, in that case about the dramatic events and horrific events in Norway, where he was saying this is the way we approach this because we were in Norway and we didn't want to we knew that people, if they saw these dead bodies, they'd be seeing people that they knew or the children of people they knew. And what we're talking about here with aggregation and apps, where we're basically talking about, and it picks up on that question, where we're talking about sort of borderless content and content that just goes anywhere without any of this particular context. And I just wonder whether any of you want to kind of reflect on this, if you like, this contrast between content that is culturally bounded versus the commercial imperative, and the technological possibility of getting your content everywhere, on every device, regardless of the context within which it was created. Because I just hear a bit of a mismatch between the world we're talking about in this session and the world we were talking about ethics in the last session. I don't know if any of you are up to picking that one up.
I'll just kick off. Yeah, I mean, I think when a lot of this material, so Facebook, for example, have had to rule on certain pictures and things appearing within a Facebook context, and which I think comes back to what the brand may want to do for its specific audience in a national context, and it will want to do things very differently. When you're talking about a Facebook or a Google, they will make judgments based on a global level. You can't be as specific, and I think we're going to see more and more of these issues emerge where the American view of taste and decency appears, and people say, well, actually, is that right for my national context?
We certainly, we're not alone in having to deal with this. This has actually been seen in, for instance, international television, for instance, over 30, 40 years, where television news had to deal with different sensibilities of, do you show overt violence or not? Is it all right to show the consequences of war, or do you sanitize it? We've had these debates before, and organizations have had to deal with them. And absolutely, and we'll see as time goes on, not only editorial organizations, but aggregators and others having to deal with this, because in the end, nobody wants to put off the audience in such a way that they stop using the sources. So.
Yeah, Jim.
Just to address the context thing, I mean, I think I'm sort of a believer that a lot of the new things are not that new. I mean, the idea that your journalism, the web somehow has made it that your journalism can be taken out of context. I mean, you've always been able to take journalism out of context where, people would quote a story to their friend and completely mischaracterize it. And the only thing that's changed is the speed in which that mischaracterization can get around the world. But I mean, the lack of context is something, that's where I mean we have to give up the control. If somebody wants to take a investigative series that we spend 2 weeks working on, throw it up on their Facebook page and completely mischaracterize it, like, there's nothing we can do about that. I think the only we can do is control the quality of the journalism behind that link and do the best we can to make sure that we're as bulletproof as we can be to those accusations. But the context piece, I think, that's one of the core things I mean when we have to give up control, because we're not going to control what people say or how they characterize what we do.
Okay. Can I just get a sense if anybody else wants to ask a question? Otherwise, I will ask the last question. No? Okay. Madhav, a question to you. You're head of strategic partnerships for Google, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Which news organizations would count as a strategic partner?
That's a great question, and considering that I started at Google 18 months ago and there wasn't anybody doing my role is even longer than what's up on that slide. That shows how ridiculous it is. Basically, what I try to do is to almost connect up some of the crazy product teams that are in Google that have new ideas that require collaboration from news publishers to see if this is useful. And so we work with it's true that I cover EMEA, but effectively I cover right now, because there's just me. I'm working my way through the atlas, and I have way too many air miles, and my carbon footprint is too high.
But news organizations in general are strategic partners?
Oh yes, definitely, and we view that it's not just a newspaper or a broadcaster or an online-only play. We don't see it that way at all. We don't divide this up. And I know this is quite a newspaper-heavy organization, and I actually come from a TV news background, and there are TV news conferences as well. And I've been encouraging everybody that I think we should just come together a hell of a lot more.
Okay. Thank you very much to Madhav for that, and thanks to all of our panel for a really interesting discussion. And will you join with me in thanking them? Thank you.